10 years ago, I was retired. But here's a little known fact. I was retired from a job that closely followed the Federal Open Market Committee. Now, I'm not an economist. My background was in communications. But I knew inflation was a factor that I had to continue to follow in my DIY retirement, too. So Wednesday afternoon was my World Cup event this week. I tuned in, and it was clear from Kevin Warsh's first FOMC press conference that we were entering a new monetary regime. In this week's video, I'm going to explain what DOT means for DIY retirees. Let's begin with some background. I pay attention to the Fed's group of policymakers, the Federal Open Market Committee, or FOMC, to understand where inflation and interest rates may be headed for my DIY retirement planning. Earlier this month, the Consumer Price Index headline measure for May hit a 4.2%, while the core CPI, which excludes food and energy, was 2.9%. Now, the Fed follows the Personal Consumption Expenditures, or PCE indexes shown there, and they are a month behind. We won't see May's PCE numbers until later in June. Nonetheless, the FOMC decided to hold its policy rate of the Fed funds rate to a range of 3.5 to 3.7%, where it's been since the beginning of the year. Now, the FOMC also released its latest summary of economic projections, which include a projection for the ideal policy rate at the end of this year. And in March, that rate was at 3.4% in the median. But now the dots suggest that it's going to be 3.8% as the ideal rate for the end of this year. That's maybe a quarter point hike somewhere between now and the year end, but let's look at that carefully. The secret is the dot plots that drive these include a projection from each participant of the FOMC meeting. Now, I've done videos on this in the past, and I'm not really a fan of the dot plot. I think it's a mysterious art form that ought to expire. The latest dots, though, are telling a story of great uncertainty around the table. Half the policymakers want at least one hike later this year, and others are not so convinced. So here is the latest dot plot, and you can see the cluster of dots there that pull up that median rate to 3.8% by the end of this year. And for 2027, the median projection is to go to 3.6%, just a slight back to where we are about now. You could see, though, that there is a wide variety of opinion there for just a year ahead. And then by 2028, it's supposed to fall to 3.4%, a little lower than we are right now. But note the number of dots here. Chair Warsh did not submit any dots for this SEP. He's not a fan of it, but also notice that there are 18 in the other clusters and only 17 in 2028. Could that be now Governor Powell knowing that he will be gone by year-end 2028? I don't know. Here's why I think this is all misleading. You're asking people to put a dot in for the year-end in subsequent years without explaining anything about that dot. And if you look at the median for the long-range target, it's 3.1%. Now, that is actually less than where it was 10 years ago when I started this whole journey. It raises questions on how these dots are collected and reported. Are we going to live with the 3% inflation for a while? Is that what they're suggesting here, even though the target's 2%? Now, my prediction is the Fed is more likely to hike in September, but there is a possibility that they'll keep the rates here until December to give Chairman Warsh time for these 5 task forces to write a new Fed playbook. Maybe one that doesn't include this monstrous dot plot anymore. Anyway, if you go to my X feed at I Was Retired, same handle here as here on YouTube. You can follow my comments on inflation and DIY retirement. I'll be watching carefully as the Fed goes to Jackson Hole in August and find out what happens in these fall FOMC meetings. How does a DIY retiree process all this information? Well, one thing I do is update my general inflation assumptions in my long-range plans. When I began using Boldin, I defaulted to a 3% average inflation factor. I set the optimistic at 2 and the pessimistic at 4%, and I used 3%. That was actually being conservative. Where I began 10 years ago, inflation had been running well below the 2% target. Now, recently, I've moved that up from 3 to 4%. I asked Boldin AI to compare my assumptions with the default ranges, and it noted that your current settings are a bit different. General inflation is set to 4%, where the Boldin's default is 2.54%. It also, medical inflation, I've set it at 6%. Boldin's default is 3.36%. By the way, you can change the assumptions here under rate assumptions, and you can either use a custom number, the recommended historical rate, or an optimistic and pessimistic rates. How about you? What did you think of Chairman Warsh's press conference? What do you think about the brevity of the statement? What inflation rate are you using in your long-term plan? Comment below. I'll conclude with my standard warning. I am not an economist. I am not a financial planner. I have no initials after my name. So take these as entertaining ideas from one educated DIY retiree to another. Always do your own due diligence and seek out a professional if you need one.